大家好，我是梁燕。今天周一早上9点钟，我们又开始我们的每周一的金融活动。今天主要是谈谈2021年经济那些事。有请我们的主持人上场。
Just $67. You can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera or use any
I'm James Grigger, Chief Investment Officer for NZ Funds, and every week we're taking the opportunity to bring you a variety of perspectives on financial markets, financial advice and developments here at NZ Funds. It is Monday, 20th of September at 9 a.m. Last week we outlined how we have kept our approach to investment opportunities simple. If an asset offers both the opportunity of a return and safeguards against a total loss of capital, we will consider it as a candidate for investment. And this has led us to invest in commodities, cryptocurrencies, technology companies, and last week we discussed uranium. This week we continue that theme and discuss natural gas and its place in the portfolios. But first, I'm very pleased to welcome Nick Davenport, founder and director of Lanico. Lanico makes respiratory filters and devices using wool from specially selected sheep flocks in central Otago. Lanico was supplying material to Chinese mask makers, but the Australian bushfires and COVID-19 related supply chain disruptions in 2020 prompted the company to start making its own face masks. Fast forward to today, and Lanico counts NASA and the recent New Zealand Olympic team among some of its customers. Nick, we really appreciate you joining us this morning. It's fantastic to get some businesses outside our usual listed company businesses to hear about, one, how things have gone and how things have developed. And for you, it's been a massive change over the last 2 years, given what's happened with COVID and the technology that your company makes. But also, I guess, on a wider scheme around, there's very little opportunity in the New Zealand market, we think, to talk about companies that take our agriculture and primary produce and I guess develop it into technology to increase the margin and then export it. We've had Fonterra on this call, and it's a fantastic company, but they export commodities. And you're in the business of exporting wool, but you do quite a lot to that wool before you export it, meaning it's a great contributor to, I guess, value add to the New Zealand economy. So great to have you here this morning, and really looking forward just to hearing about the journey, how you developed the business over time and where to from here. So perhaps we could start with you introducing your background and Lanico and specifically what it does.
Sure. Thanks very much, James, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and have a chat this morning. It's quite a simple story, really, but nonetheless a long one. My background is materials and marketing, so I did my MBA at Auckland University at about the time that they were invented, and then worked for a company and then decided not to work for a company and start my own as a materials company supplying polymer products into manufacturing in New Zealand. And that journey was nearly 20 years, building a business from nothing to support manufacturers in New Zealand during a time of great transition when manufacturing was moving out. And nonetheless, some still starting and moving towards higher technology materials and products such as healthcare products. So that company was manufacturing components for those manufacturers, and our export strategy was to follow those manufacturers as they left New Zealand and set up offshore. So we piggybacked our export business by developing relationships locally and then spreading them globally. But that business there had one simple model, was to buy big and sell small, to add as much value along the way onto materials. And by understanding the functionality of materials, which is my background, enabled me to create a business and create value. And it was about 10 years ago now, so obviously talking about some reasonable time spans here. 10 years ago, I was manufacturing air filters from polyester for health manufacturing, health equipment manufacturing machinery, devices. And there were huge margins in it. I thought, oh, this is pretty interesting, but it's just a bit of polyester, no real science in it, and there's no real competitive advantage nor intellectual property in it. And at the same time, I started researching by accident wool, because wool was being used by an appliance manufacturer in New Zealand as a rotary seal for a high temperature gasket in a clothes dryer, a domestic clothes dryer. And nobody in New Zealand really knew much about it, so I went on a hunt globally for who could make the best one, and I found one in the US. And that started my journey of understanding the functionality of what New Zealand wool fibre could do in an environment surrounded by plastic materials. So I then also, through that connection, found out some potential for air filtration using wool technology, and particularly what's called electrostatic wool filtration. So if you think of, you're wearing a woolen jumper and you rub it against something plastic, you'll generate a lot of static electricity. That's an unbalanced static charge. We can build an air filter media with a balanced static charge, which makes it like a dust magnet. And that became the core of the technology on respiratory filtration. So that became the seed of an idea to start a company. So in my previous company, I set up in a corner doing desk research for a year on this market. Was told that no, there's no competitive opportunity there because wool is going to be more expensive than oil-based polymers. Possibly I should have listened to them, but nonetheless we persisted because we saw that there was more than one handle on this story. And the more we drilled, the more we found there was a technical competitive advantage. And being a technical person, it's really exciting. So we got really excited about making these materials from wool. And I guess if you talk it back to me and those origins about the why, the DNA of it all, I guess it's that background of making products out of polymers for 20 years, buying big and selling small, could see an opportunity to do the same with wool, yet we had almost a boundless resource of wool grown in New Zealand. So why didn't anybody else see this opportunity? And I guess there was nobody else in the world who had started a materials company like my previous one, which targeted New Zealand, which was a market an inch deep and a mile wide, but all of those industries suited global markets. And then why had they not seen wool as an opportunity? Well, wool was icebreaker. Wool was, all carpets and clothing and textiles. It wasn't seen to be high-tech industrial materials. But my background meant I could see the opportunity quite clearly. All we had to do was work out how to make it work and make it work competitively. So hence, when I say 10 years, the last 7 years have been very heavy into, as I said, starting with desk research, moving through to scientific research, you mentioned that specially selected sheep. We actually even went further than that. We've bred a breed designed to produce the fibre for the filters, and gone so deep into the fibre to two things. One, to create that competitive edge where we knew if we were going to be competing against synthetic materials, every big materials corporation in the world is heavily invested in synthetic materials. We were going to be a lone voice. So we had to do our homework. So we did, and we got assistance from AgResearch and others. We ended up buying the non-wovens manufacturing line from AgResearch in Lincoln, and they could no longer afford to run it. We taught ourselves how to make filter media and non-woven materials from wool. We researched all the science. I hired the best scientist I could find out of Auckland University to drive our science program. And I found the best sheep breeder, I believe, in the world, who had a track record of success in breeding an animal to a market objective. And he'd done it twice. So when we met, and to do that takes 10 years to build a sheep breed to success and prove it. So we embarked on this breeding program to examine every wool type that we could find, see how well it performed, understand the attributes that provided the functional performance that the market needed, and breed it. But it was a little bit more complicated than that. You just can't tell a farmer to just go, hey, go and breed that sheep. They just don't believe you if you come from Auckland in particular. So we had to get that right knowledge, and that's where Andy, our breeder, was immensely valuable. He totally understood what we're trying to achieve and is a visionary in the wool industry and the sheep industry, because he's focused on markets, not on production, and on value and not on volume. And that ticked the boxes so far as our model was concerned. We had to have a provable supply chain of products superior to anything in the world that we could defend. And hence the breeding program was both for performance and for defense, and becomes one of the pillars of the technology that we produce. So that when we got a call about 3 years ago from NASA, they said, we heard you make air filters out of wool. We're quite interested because we know there's some properties of wool that are quite interesting. Are you interested in applying, because the tenders are about to close and all the major manufacturers in the world have already submitted their tenders? Okay, of course. So we sent our material up there, and up here behind me is a picture of my chief science officer at the Johnson Space Center in Houston with the engineering team. We did tests, and it was selected. And it was selected for critical life support on Orion, which is the next manned spacecraft to the moon, which should travel in its first manned flight in 23. Hopefully there'll be a first woman on the wall woman in the world on the moon in 2024. And they'll be protected on that mission by our filters. And it's interesting to share the story of the why. Plastic filters, of course, are plastic, and they don't like water particularly. They don't like hot particles. So if you think, if you've ever seen that movie, one of my favourites, Apollo 13, with when Tom Hanks tries to go to the moon as Jim Lovell, they have a little problem on the way to the moon, and they tell Houston they've got a problem, that the spaceship's exploded and is running out of air. Well, they think they've fixed those problems for this next version of the trip, but they all have now high energy devices and lithium batteries, which they see as the most likely cause of a fault, which could emit hot, dangerous particles within a spacecraft. So if you can just think, you've got 30 cubic meters of air, you've got 5 people in a spacecraft on the most expensive vehicle in mankind's history, on the biggest voyage of exploration since 1972. And your laptop computer starts fizzing away. You can't open the window, and you can't fire a fire extinguisher out because you've got to breathe the air that's in it. So they use this water and atomized water to cool the source, The synthetic filters will glaze over and become unusable after about 3 minutes, which isn't a long time if you've got 144 hours to get around the moon and back to Earth. So the wool filter in this application extends that to 40 minutes. So because of how it handles water, because of how it handles hot particles, because of how it handles very fine particles, it was selected. So that gives us this incredible trust in the technology. We know it works. As a lone voice, we have to prove to the world that it works. And I guess most recently, the New Zealand Olympic team selected the technology for use in Japan and used it very successfully, where it was one of the pillars of success of a very successful Olympic Games in Tokyo. One of the other advantages of the technology is it is the easiest to breathe through, the lowest resistance electrostatic filter media on the planet. So when it's used in a mask, for example, it just so happens to perform exceptionally. And our job, what I'm doing right now, is trying to create messages and tell the world how good this is and how they can run this technology that's based on New Zealand wool through their mask making machines, through their air filter making machines and other devices. The other little intro, because I'm obviously giving you the whole story here, the technology creates opportunities, and it creates opportunities for new devices. Because of this performance that it offers, it creates opportunities where there never were opportunities before, purely in function. And then on top of that comes the environmental and sustainability issue. And on top of that comes the New Zealand economy issue. So, and this loops right back to the beginning of the story now, where when we first looked at this opportunity, thought, well, why? So my previous company was successful in creating materials, but it was making a lot of stuff out of plastics and polymers. So when wool came along, it presented an opportunity to do something different. And I thought, well, for the rest of my working life, I'm going to want to make something that really lasts, that's meaningful, and ties in with what I was taught back in Economics 101 many years before, and I remembered it because I had to sit 101 3 times, was this law of economic comparative advantage. So if New Zealand was very, very good at growing wool, why the hell was it creating the wool that the world didn't want and exporting it bulk across the world to be turned into other products, which seemed to be what was happening?
Nick, to give you an insight, we just bought at home, just bought a rug. We've just moved house, bought a rug from the US, and the rug was made out of New Zealand wool. I mean, it's just ludicrous.
Well, yes, so long as it wouldn't be ludicrous if there were lots and lots of rug makers in New Zealand as well, and they were all at full capacity.
Yeah.
And that's really the trick. Is we want to, we don't want to cliche it or make wool great again, but it's just a big unexploited opportunity for New Zealand and for the world to create materials which are sustainable and renewable. And our company's mission is to have the most sustainable, renewable and biodegradable filter media on the planet. And that technology is to protect human health, nothing else. And lo and behold, we've come across a pandemic in the middle of this. And you mentioned the pivot. Beginning of 19 year, we were gearing up to produce masks in China for Australian bushfires and start selling them through Bunnings in Australia and New Zealand. That all got turned upside down because the Chinese government basically stopped anything from being exported. All our wool was up in China and they wouldn't let us have it. We had to pay for it all to be made. They wouldn't send it to us, so we were totally stuffed. So we decided that we'll make masks in New Zealand because New Zealand's run out of masks. And the government, the Beehive, got hold of us and said, can you make masks? I said, not yet, but we will, because we were making filter elements for other people, for masks and respirators and devices. So we threw all of our resources and millions of dollars at creating a mask manufacturing line, having it accredited to global medical manufacturing standards, with the capability of producing millions and millions of masks a year to provide New Zealand with supply chain security, and at the same time add value to New Zealand primary produce, at the same time to lift farm incomes by because our breeding program is designed on creating value for the farmer, not just using the farmer. We pay a premium to the farmer if they grow wool to our specification, if it meets what the market requires. So, yes, it's an extraordinary time against a backdrop of global lowest ever wool prices for what New Zealand produces currently. We can one mask, one face mask will use about a gram of wool, and we thought, well, that's not going to change the world a couple of years ago, so we won't go there. Now it's a different story. To say that there's billions of masks being made is a total understatement. We actually have no idea, and nobody really does, what the total number of masks being produced are. But you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that even with a gram in a mask, we can make big inroads into New Zealand's primary industry. Bearing in mind, New Zealand's wool exports are 700 million NZ dollars, forecast to grow to 690 million in 5 years. I think that's the current forecast. So reduction. So we just think that's a crying shame. If the sheep aren't growing wool, then they're going to have to put trees on there. And if anybody wants any tourism back, they don't come to look at trees. They've got plenty of trees of their own. New Zealand's heritage and legacy in wool growing is lost. So there's a lot of activity in the industry, but we have the highest value proposition usage for wool in the world.
Nick, when you were sitting there doing your desk research 10 years ago, and was there, and it sounds like, and perhaps it's just as you go through the journey, but when the penny drops that you realise no one else is doing this, at that point that must be a pretty exciting realisation, but then I guess how do you decide what track to go down? I mean, you said you talked about the dryer with the between the, so you could have gone down that route. There's masks. I guess there's a lot of forms and ways that this technology could be used, and the world is your oyster because no one's ever done this type of use wool in this way. How, as an entrepreneur, do you sort of focus that great discovery into how do we commercialize this?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, we had to question ourselves whether or not it was a great discovery or we were just stupid because the rest of the world hadn't done it. But as I said, it comes back to that reality check. Perhaps nobody has seen this because of the situation we're in. Let's stand up. It was a real stand-up moment, and I think Sir Paul Callaghan was alive at the time, and he was writing about how New Zealand should be growing its value, growing its exports. I was a manufacturer trying to export, and I couldn't see the competitive advantage in what I was doing. This one rang a lot of bells. So I says, yeah, this has got sort of ethical, moral legs for me. It fits with what I'm trying to do. Then we have to look at the value. Then we thought, well, filtering air, people breathe air, it's linked to health, it's got a value proposition. But we realised that we had to get the value through the whole chain. So we had to get significant value. And I went back, I had that sort of check with my previous business experience was to buy big and sell small. So if we were buying big chunks of polymers offshore and selling them a gram at a time, cost didn't matter, didn't matter cost to ship it into New Zealand, it still made sense. Here we could ship product offshore if it had high value. And one of the things we would do is say, if I could make a filter to protect your child's health for a month, what would you pay? Without showing them anything. And they said, oh, $100. $100 a gram is pretty good to me. So that meant there was something in that value chain, which means we could afford to pay the farmer, we could pay for the process and the cleaning, the manufacturing process, develop and protect the IP and do the marketing, and make $1. And everybody in that chain could could benefit. Therefore, it should work. If the customer wants it and they see it protects and it works, it's going to work. And that's what gave us the confidence to go ahead.
So then how do you go, you just picked up that mask and it had Emirates on it. And I'm assuming therefore Emirates is a customer.
No, that's marketing. We put their name on it, then we go for them.
Oh, right. Because I was going to say, how you just answered the question. How does a small New Zealand company with world-leading technology, albeit, but it's still how do you get into some of these companies and speak to the right people who are making the decisions to say that this is the technology you want? Because obviously that's where you've been successful as well. But that's, what do you go on LinkedIn and see CEO Emirates and do, it's obviously a really difficult part of the journey.
Yeah, look at this. And honestly, my background is not B2C marketing. Don't get me wrong, we've been thrown into this by COVID, and I'm trying to get out of it, but it's very, very lucrative. So we did do this one. So we approached them and said, this product is going to be so good for the Olympic team to protect you. We said this in October last year. So it's brilliant. You should use it. And they said, and they tried it and it worked. And I said, right. So we've got a reference point. We've got to build trust. But our model is to use those as examples, to use NASA as an example, to use the Olympic team as an example. And then our B2B model is to say, just behind us here, we've got a manufacturing plant where our wool comes into us here in Ellerslie. We turn that into roll stock of filter media. We can export that high performance filter media to anybody who's making masks in the world. So our challenge at the moment is to find those mask makers and get the story to them why they should be using this product as opposed to what they're doing. And that takes time and money to reach those people, and it's quite challenging at the moment. That's our marketing strategy currently. At the same time, we're going gung-ho with making product and making cash by making masks and proving the concept that it works. So, because we're not just, we are a filter media company, not a mask company. And so that filter media goes into this thing here for a kitchen range hood. We've got, this is a mask, but this is the latest one for Australian bushfires. You notice the colour, it doesn't catch fire, so we've developed another product there. There's a filter here that goes into toilet systems. And when you press the flush button, it sucks the air out, and all those COVID particles which are in the air get caught in this filter. So there's all sorts of applications where the technology is used, not just masks. It's basically everywhere that people breathe. So that's our marketing challenges are huge, immense. And that's why we're actually raising capital at the moment, because we just, the market, the visibility is growing rapidly. We just have to build our marketing assets. Yeah.
I'd definitely love to touch on that, because I think that's that's a story that we should talk about. Before we jump into that though, you mentioned something around manufacturing and the fact that, big opportunity, big pivot, millions of dollars to make that pivot. I just want to understand the sort of the mindset of someone that owns a business, the technology, you're absolutely, you've been working with it for 10 years, you know how it works, it's going to solve issues, but to make an investment in a pivot like that is a pretty monumental decision. How did you go about that, actually making that decision and going down this track? Because, this is, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but this could have all blown over, faster than you thought by the time you'd spent your millions of dollars, or, there could have been, there's big manufacturers out there like 3M and things that, will be also competing with you, but it's obviously proven successful. But I guess maybe that's what separates entrepreneurs to the others, is you sort of don't think about that, you just focus on yourself and crack on. What is the mindset of making those decisions?
Yeah, don't think about what could possibly go wrong. because if we had, we definitely wouldn't have started. I probably wouldn't even have started the business, really realizing how big it is. Just to think now that we've created the first sheep breed in the world, which we've trademarked to support this program. We've developed the IP and the manufacturing processes to make the filter media. We've made weldable face masks with wool in them. When we look back, it is colossal. And then to pivot into actually becoming a mask maker when the world started to make masks, it seems like nuts. But we're actually approached by the government and said, the government needs this many million masks. What can you do? And underlying that, there was already a mask market, a demand. As we said, bushfires hit Australia, and Australia caught fire 2 years ago. They ran out of masks. And they started to train New Zealand's masks, so that when COVID hit, that's why there was nothing here. So that underlying market was already a value proposition for us, but masks were a small part of it. We were doing industrial canisters for industrial masks already. So that underlying business was already there. To actually make a disposable mask for medical and other applications wasn't a large step. It was an expensive pivot and an opportunity where we saw we could really help New Zealand by saying, well, look, New Zealand can start to invest in sustainable, renewable materials in its disposable products in the fight against COVID-19, no matter what happens. And not only that, we can make products which design and fit Marion Pacifica in New Zealand and help the health service. That was quite big. And being patriotic Kiwis, there was a bit of that as well. The buzz in this room here, 18 months ago, when these things were happening and we were getting approached by governments around the world, was quite significant. And the advice that we received was, this is not going to blow over. I said, what do you mean it's going to last 6 months? They said, this is going to last more than a year. And I never imagined it would be here where we are now. And the other thing, during that process, we started to learn a lot more about the process and the regulations. And I'll just give you a quick example here. You'll see on the television and in the news and the Prime Minister talking about N95 masks. And you'll see everybody wearing this other stuff, which is surgical masks, the little blue things, and cloth masks. Every reporter wears a beautiful cloth mask. You can drive a Kenworth truck through the difference in performance between the two. So why do people wear N95 masks at one side and the rest of the country wear these others? The answer is because there aren't enough. So us little suckers are being told to wear the stuff that doesn't work so that you can protect the healthcare workers. So who's at the front line? Only the people in the hospitals. What about the supermarket workers? No, they don't count. So the opportunity that we've found by producing one of our products, which we call blatant marketing here, the Breezy mask, is it performs when it's done under a fit test. It'll pass an N95 test, but it's 10 times easier to breathe through. Bingo! So we've got a product which fits in the gap. It aligns with US standards that have been developed, but New Zealand isn't aware of these standards yet. So we've got a massive opportunity to develop and market this product in this range. So a long answer to a short question. Why? Yeah, underlying business, the volume kept growing, but then it fell off a cliff in September last year. It really hurt us for two reasons. One, somebody who we contracted with for a large volume of masks decided that they'd much rather get them from China. That still hurts very, very deeply. So we cut our staff from nearly 40 people to 6, and hunkered down and said we're going to get through this. And now we've got 25 people here. So and new products. So it's fascinating. I mean, we've got people designing products around our technology. It just takes time for people to develop a new product because the technology works, and they'll invest their millions in developing products for the future. And there's a lot like that. So we know our technology, we know the regulations, we know the rules. We know the spin, and we just got to execute. So we've got a huge opportunity in front of us.
Nick, on a wider question on the technology, as I go down to the Countdown supermarket wearing a mask, and often I can't find the mask that I bought, so I delve into the box of blue surgical masks that I know don't work. Can you give us a 2-minute lesson on the reason we wear a mask is not to protect ourselves, so we don't, I guess, shed virus particles out there, but actually there are masks that can protect you, like the one that you manufacture. Am I getting that right?
You are, but there are very few in the latter category, and there are billions in the other category. And what's happened with Delta is transmitted by aerosols. Now you might notice a slight change in the commentators by some of the spokespeople that you see in the media about starting to refer to aerosols. And aerosols are the very fine particles that never settle in the air. Whereas previously you were talking about fomites or droplets. This is when somebody sneezes, these particles come out and they have to fall down, land on the surface, so you rapidly go around and clean everything. That's what Delta 1 was. We think it was probably both. Delta 2, now they say, is transmitted by aerosols because it can be transmitted over that barrier in the Crown Plaza. It can be transmitted between one door opening and another door in a hotel and an MIQ. That's because it's an aerosol, and an aerosol particle can travel up to 27 kilometres an hour. You can't outrun it. So it's all about concentration. So how do you protect the mass population, exclude it totally with a surgical mask? The answer is it's impossible. It'll stop the droplets. If you can seal a surgical mask around your face enough to stop the very fine particles, you won't be able to breathe very well and you won't wear it. So compliance is important. So the World Health Organization says 3 things, and 3 things only that we agree with. 1, for a mask to work, it has to have a very good filter. It has to take out the ultrafine particles down to 0.3 microns. 2, it has to have a fit. It has to seal around the face and stop the ingress into the lungs, which gets into the blood. And number 3, it's got to be breathable. So you can easily make a mask that filters, that fits over the face, but it's not breathable. It's called a plastic bag. Right, that will work. That'll stop you from getting particles, but you've got to breathe. So the other end of that is what this is. And it's all because of the wool and its immense ability to capture particles electrostatically. And those virus particles stick to it. And they're tiny. And you can't load it up. The only thing that determines its life is how you use it. So there is an answer. And the World Health Organization says use a cloth mask, but that's because there is nothing else. If you want to protect yourself, you want to protect your doctors, don't you? You want to protect your nurses. Who do you want to partially protect? I want to partially protect the policemen, so you get them something from China. How do you protect the supermarket workers? Oh, you give them a surgical mask because they're much cheaper. That is what I see as the great shame at the moment, but that's because there isn't enough supply.
Well, I'm sure at least the over 100 people that are listening to you right now, I'm glad I pre-ordered my mask from your website, because I think you might get a run on them, because I think there's that false concept of security because you've got something around your face, but actually it's the technology that actually helps.
Science, yeah. This is deeply embedded in science and knowledge and regulation.
Let's touch on as a small and fast-growing business. You mentioned the great Paul Callanan before, but how are you going to approach this market? You're talking about capital raising. What's the process that you have to go through for that, and what's the journey you hope to go on, and why are you doing it?
I guess a 10-year-old startup like this is continually raising cash. And being in New Zealand, you never ever raise enough, in my view. particularly if you're in a manufacturing business and a materials business, people don't believe you. They don't get it. They're looking for much shorter term returns. So we haven't really deviated from our goal to create a long-term business which generates value right throughout the supply chain from here on in. So yeah, we've had to always raise cash, and we've always been short of cash. This time, it's at my stage in my career, it's now or never. So we're going on a big push at the moment to do this final bit. Within what we've achieved over the last 10 years now, with the proof of concept in every market sector that we're in, we've consolidated our supply chain, we've locked down our IP, we've bettered our trademarks. Now's the time just to scale it. And that the scaling is, one, the production side is pretty straightforward. It's the marketing and getting the message across, because we know how big the opportunity is, but we know how big the opposition is in the synthetic field, not in the natural field, in the synthetic field, and they'll throw everything at you that they possibly can. One of our advisors is the science advisor from A2 Milk, and as you know, with their story, when they started to become successful, they knew whether they'd be successful because they were getting sued, and as soon as they broke through that, they were away. But in their view, we've got more handles. We've got more depth than A2 ever had, and therefore we've just got to do it. We've just got to fund ourselves correctly and get the growth. And our marketing assets are our weakest point. We've thrown everything at building a sheep breed, and that's cost millions. We've done all the science and research and development work, and that's cost millions. And we've built our manufacturing plant, and that's cost millions. But in terms of our marketing assets, you can probably see it behind me. So it's time for a change. We want people offshore singing our story. We want thought leaders telling our story. We want our industry behind us, and then there's no stopping us.
It's an amazing story, and you mentioned A2 Milk, and I guess that is the excitement of something like this. Is it's not just one product. You've shown us 6 in the space of 30 minutes around different ways to use the same technology and all the stuff. And the IP and the technology behind it is is really makes you proud that we can use something that's been a New Zealand stalwart for over 100 years to and to be able to sort of use it in really modern technology and modern uses. So look, I'm sure hearing that story, you'll be successful in your raise, and we really look forward to following the next part of the journey. But it certainly doesn't sound like we're anywhere near the end of at least the COVID part. But then that just sort of, I guess, launches you into lots of different avenues as well. So that's the exciting part of a business like this.
Yeah, it's changing so much of the world. Building regulations are changing, transportation regulations are changing. So opportunities are huge, and of course it builds profile for wool as well. It's a healthy product, so hopefully it'll have a spin-off effect for other people. And you could all the while you could be wearing one of those really expensive high margin icebreaker tops as you're traveling the world marketing. Yeah, well, don't get me too distracted about those stories. And I guess it's one of those things that when you mentioned before about what we were looking at, is we don't want to say, oh, this is great, so let's put wool into insulation. It's too good to be used for insulation. You would not reward a farmer by making it a bulk commodity for insulation. Similarly, you're not going to make a farmer rich by putting it into shoes, because they're a short-term product with a ceiling price. In the garments, certainly in the top end, you might be able to get some decent dollars for the fine fibre, but we're trying to get better dollars for all of the farmers.
Well, it's a fantastic story, Nick, and thanks so much for joining us this morning and talking about it. And good luck for the next stage. And great to talk to some entrepreneurs in the country that's really making a difference. So thanks very much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on board. Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Well, we'll move on to listed markets and other asset classes, but I think that's an absolutely fascinating story around using something as simple as wool and go through an entire breeding program to produce something that's so relevant for today's environment. I'm certainly not a mask skeptic, but as you walk around Auckland, who are still in lockdown with those surgical masks, I now sort of start to second guess if it's even worth doing that. And actually, we should all be buying masks that actually are going to protect us, not just for making us feel safe. But anyway, interesting story. And if you want to learn more about Lamico, they've got a great website, and I'm sure Nick would love to hear from you if you're keen to learn more about the business. Last week we talked about uranium and clean tech, and the fact that while the traditional asset classes of shares and bonds are, we've always talked about forming the key part of our portfolios. There are asset classes out there that are idiosyncratic, meaning it doesn't matter what the market's doing, doesn't matter what our return projections are around shares or bonds. Some asset classes will beat to their own drum, and that's really important in an environment like we're in now, where we've had a fantastic run in markets. Interest rates are still trying to decide what to do, and we need to think about how we can diversify our portfolios to continue to drive returns as we have done over the previous 10 years since the global financial crisis. Clean tech's interesting because it's causing a whole lot of unintended consequences. Uranium, because the popularity of installing nuclear power stations and the demand for the uranium commodity is massively increasing, and we talked about that at length last week. The other unintended consequence, and it's a good thing, is the amount of coal being produced is decreasing. And the reason for that is the number of coal-fired power stations is decreasing. They're either being shut down, or they're just not being built like they once were because of the transition from the coal economy to more cleaner forms of energy. In New Zealand, gas-fired power stations are still considered bad in terms of carbon output, in carbon output terms, and the building of more gas-fired power stations would be quite controversial in New Zealand. If you go to Europe, however, that's what they're basing their whole decarbonisation theme on. It's moving away from coal, especially the industrialised nations such as the UK, China and Germany. And they're moving away from coal and building a lot more gas-fired power stations because although they emit carbon dioxide, they certainly don't emit as much as coal-fired stations. And so what you've got a huge increase, or at least a stability in demand of natural gas. But last year there was a big glut. There was a big glut of natural gas for a couple of reasons, but mostly because of the demand from big industrialized nations and manufacturing. And so that glut in demand really put paid to any more drilling or exploration of gas. And you saw, especially in places like the US and Europe, where the exploration of gas really took a hit because of the fact that there was no more demand for the commodity. And then at the same time, though, we've had a very fast bounce back, and we've talked about it at length, but there's been a number of industries which have really driven way past pre-COVID demand, and the demand for lots of goods and services, cars being one of them, has really increased. And so you've had this glut in demand and then a huge bounce back, but a real restriction in supply. And the restriction in supply is really hard to turn around because it's really hard to all of a sudden get the capital and start spending money on drilling for oil and gas. It just takes time. And that's especially the case in the US, where a lot of gas came from because of shale gas. And shale gas has been a massive contributor to the energy supply across the world. The US turned from an importer of gas and oil to an exporter because of shale. But a lot of those fields got shut down because of this demand glut. But also even prior to COVID-19, just the demand for some of these commodities was decreasing. So now you've had the economic bounce back, and you're also now getting extreme weather events. Now, whether this is related to climate change, let's not get into this debate, but it certainly looks like we're in for much more extreme weather events across the world, whether it's hotter summers and colder winters. And at the moment, science says that it is due to climate change, and therefore we should get used to the fact that these weather events are going to continue for some time to come. And with that continues this hot summer and colder winters. And we've seen that in Europe just recently. They've had a record hot summer in some parts of Europe, and where temperatures exceed well over 40 degrees, and sometimes there were a few places when we got over 50. And then we're now leading into winters where there's the opportunity to potentially have cold winters. If you remember last year, or the start of this year, Texas actually had one of its coldest winters ever. And we had record temperatures in a state in the US where that usually doesn't happen. And so these extreme weather events are all of a sudden creating some panic in the natural gas market, where actually we've needed a whole lot of gas to generate a lot more electricity than we thought to run our air conditioners. And now we're worried about a cold winter needing to be used to run electricity to heat the Northern Hemisphere. And this is really what the dynamic is in natural gas. It's got nothing to do with economic growth per se, but it's got to do with the fact that when you don't continue to explore and produce some of these commodities, and the fact that what you normally rely on to, fill the void of electricity demand when electricity demand skyrockets is coal, and that really is no longer an option as it once was. The popularity of natural gas is really starting to make things a bit nervous for some parts of the world. And so in Europe, you've seen gas prices increase 5 or 6 times their average price from a month ago. And this is leading to questions around how they're going to supply their glutton supply for this increase in demand. And really that comes to the US, and the US is going to potentially have to fill this lack of supply by exporting LNG or exporting liquid natural gas. And exporting liquid natural gas always goes to the countries or the area that are going to pay the most for it. And Europe, given where their gas prices are going, really are going to have to pay up in order to attract that exported gas from the US into their countries to stave off any supply constraints and keep the lights on. Because in the UK and Europe, the main source of electricity is gas-fired power stations. So it's this really unique situation in the gas market, which we've been studying along with internally with our investment team, but also with some of our strategy consultants who are based in the US and the UK, to really get our heads around a really unique situation, which we think is something that we think we have the possibility of generating returns. Now, it also is something that we keep mindful of when we think about our ESG requirements and think about what's going on in the country and high gas prices and high energy costs. At some levels can be bad because more gas and things are consumed. That's a good thing in the UK and Europe because you're decreasing and have decreased your coal usage to increase gas, so that's decreasing carbon in the environment. But at the same time, higher energy prices do mean more money going into researching renewable energies because they have a higher cost to produce electricity, and these renewable energy alternatives become much more palatable when energy prices are higher. So it's a really unique situation that's really leading to some negative things around electricity prices and the consumer, but some positive things around really driving that renewable energy research. So how do we invest in something like natural gas? We only invest in the futures and options, so we're not actually buying any physical natural gas. We don't buy the companies underlying natural gas. We don't want to be involved in funding the drilling or exploration of natural gas. But we can be involved in the price momentum, which produces a return. Now, natural gas is quite volatile, and so we buy it through some futures, but through options as well. And it means that the upside is there if natural gas if natural gas prices increases. But at the same time, your risk is mitigated and capped if there's any fall in natural gas prices over a certain amount, because that's how options work. And really, NZ funds and the way that our infrastructure is set up and the way that we are able to invest in different asset classes within the mandates enable us to do this and invest in a commodity asset class, but at the same time enables us to do it through options and futures, which is a really efficient, liquid way of investing in these sorts of assets. So while at one point we are, somewhat not concerned, but have less optimism around shares at the moment when we're going through some sort of uncertainty around what markets are doing. Normally it's a September, October thing. People come back from holidays in the Northern Hemisphere, think about how they want to position their portfolios, and September, October can be quite volatile. So we can reduce some of the risk in the equity markets or share markets that we have, and actually invest in some of these other asset classes to continue to generate returns. And when markets usually calm down in November, December, that's when we can re-engage with share markets to continue to compound those returns over time. So this is a really great way to be flexible, especially within the inflation and growth portfolios, whose really biggest risk at the moment is increased inflation and increased interest rates. And to be able to protect our investors from those two risks is really important. And we think that doing it through asset classes such as commodities is one really efficient way to do it. So that's the setup for natural gas, and we talked about uranium last week, which I encourage you to read the insight, and it gives you a sense of some of the differentiated asset classes we do have. We're going to then write an investment insight on the inflation portfolios, specifically around how we think over time, given where interest rates, inflation, and what's happening within those sorts of macroeconomic drivers, how we should invest the inflation portfolios in order to fend off inflation, given the low interest rate environment. So look out for that one, because I think that's a really interesting one to how we put all these ideas together to manage the inflation portfolios. We'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed hearing from a great small entrepreneurial business such as Lamico. For those in Auckland, fingers crossed for today that we can perhaps keep our eyes on maybe being able to get a coffee, but I guess safety will be the order of the day, I'm sure. For those of you that have any questions or want any more information on any of the investment insights we write, do let us know, and we'll be happy to have a call or an email exchange to share the ideas and give you more information if you want it. Other than that, have a great week, everybody.